For the love of games! Hey everybody, I'm Nevyn with PixelAttack.net, and I am here today with Jordan and Kyle from Refract Studios, the team that made Distance, a survival racing game that recently launched into early access on Steam. I've never been one to beat around the bush, so let's go ahead and toss my warmest of welcomes to Jordan and Kyle. Why don't you guys go ahead and say a little bit about yourselves and what you do at Refract?
Sure. So first off, thanks for having us.
Hey, no problem. Glad you could be here.
Yeah, totally. So so we're Refract. We're a studio that's up in Seattle, and working as a survival racing game. It just came out on Steam Early Access, and we've been developing it for 2.5 years about now. And we did a Kickstarter in 2012 for it. It's a spiritual successor to a survival driving game called Nitronic Rush, which was like a student project we did at a school called Digipen. And then the idea with Distance is we would kind of take almost like a platforming angle to the racing genre, as well as kind of a mystery and atmosphere, heavy mystery and atmosphere in the world and environment. And as you're trying to survive the tracks, basically there's a lot of obstacles and things kind of popping up in your way, and you're just trying to survive to the end of each track. And we've been working on kind of a story mode to go along and kind of show you all the elements of the game and the world, but then there's also local and online multiplayer, as well as a level editor that we've been working on. It's actually probably the biggest project of the whole thing has been the level editor side of it, and then we have like Steam Workshop support and stuff like that.
Yeah, I gotta say that level editor has blown me away. It's ridiculous what people are coming up with for it.
Yeah, it's insane. It's so like, I mean, even for us, it's easy to just be distracted, right? Because like, every time you work on, you add updates, you get it out there, then a lot of people use it, put out new levels, and then it's, especially after the early access release, it's really hard to keep up with every new level that comes out and see what clever things people are doing with it. And half of the stuff people are doing with it, we have to spend 10 minutes being like, what object are they even using there?
Yeah, I remember when somebody, I think it was F-Zero Man, he created that pool tag level.
Yeah.
I still haven't figured out how he made that pool.
Yeah, me neither. Actually, I always was tempted to open up the level file, but I'm just never, like, I don't know, I didn't want to break the magic.
Yeah, it feels like cheating, kinda.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's go ahead and get the ball rolling with these here questions, if you're ready for me to probe your brains.
Absolutely.
Sure.
All right. Who or what were some of your biggest inspirations or driving forces, even, when it came to starting up Refract and then actually starting on Distance?
So I'd say, actually, weirdly enough, actually, just in general, the concept of influences for Refract probably is not really like heavily aligned with the actual inspirations for Distance, because just in general, when we first started up the idea of Refract, we weren't even thinking about doing a spiritual successor to Nitronic Rush. We were kind of thinking along more experimental indie type stuff, because that's actually almost every other game we've made when we were students at Digipen was experimental indie. And Nitronic Rush was the most, like, quote-unquote mainstream type of project we'd ever worked on. But a lot of, like, I'd say atmospheric storytelling and even just some kind of obscure games had definitely been, like, inspirations for us. Just we all kind of synced on certain games. I mean, I guess actually it's kind of all over the place. Everyone has games that they were inspired by in their childhood. For me, when we first were starting up, there were a lot of, like, indie games, I guess, like Limbo and kind of, I guess, games that's similar to that were trying to do storytelling. But for me, when I was younger, I was more inspired by like Half-Life and I guess even the earlier like Elder Scrolls games and some other random games that were just like they were doing kind of crazier things, and that was kind of exciting just in general starting the company. But I know that Jason definitely has a lot of like racing games that are inspirational to him. Like Carmageddon was a big one he spent a lot of time on, and he also played some other random games. I guess I won't speak for Kyle.
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, I was really inspired by story-driven games growing up, specifically like Japanese RPGs, and like Final Fantasy was, Final Fantasies in general were something that were pretty inspirational to me. And then more recently, I've actually kind of been really big into open world games, so like Grand Theft Auto and Elder Scrolls are games that are really inspirational to me. I played like some of the Rush games growing up as well, and I was a really big fan of them. I didn't necessarily realize the impact that they were going to have on me in my future when I was younger, but I definitely I enjoyed them at the time, and I was actually really big into, in general, just I would say like from a Nitronic end, I was more actually inspired by just cars, I guess, in general, because growing up, I grew up near Detroit, and it's pretty big. Cars in general have always been a big part of my life, and kind of, I guess, my family. So that's been something that kind of pushed me to wanting to work on kind of a car game. And then, like I said earlier, the story side is something that I've always been excited about too.
Yeah, so then, kind of moving into like Nitronic Rush days, it was like, at least for me, I wasn't that, I played a lot of like random racing games, but I wasn't like massive into racing games, and then I kind of like got more into it, weirdly enough, through working on Nitronic, and then going into Distance, it was like, had a completely different palette in my head going in. So yeah, we're kind of all over the place, honestly.
Yeah, it's kind of cool. A bunch of those inspirations that you guys listed weren't things that I would have actually expected. Like you mentioned Half-Life, and like now that you've said it, I can kind of see where that comes in.
Yeah.
That's really, I mean, Rush wasn't too surprising, but it's really cool to have a wider picture of that for me, because like when I look at it, I see kind of Tron and Hot Wheels, and then there's you guys come and just add in all this other stuff, and I can see bits and pieces of it in the game. That's pretty cool to hear.
It's not racing games, I would say, weren't really our favorite genres growing up. Actually, it's like in general, I'd say we really like more like first-person shooters and RPGs, I guess. So
I'm definitely on the same kind of playing field there. Like, I mean, I played Mario Kart growing up, but who hasn't, right?
Yeah.
Distance is one of the first racing games that's really like stuck. Most the rest of my Steam inventory is like platformers and first-person shooters.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, I mean, that's one quote-unquote advantage that I think we have going into the genre, is that we can kind of look at it maybe from a little bit of a different angle, just because we weren't huge into racing games our whole lives.
Yeah, you're kind of making the racing game that you want.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, there's definitely, like, I guess the more I think about it, the more I'd say that definitely storytelling and exploration are constant concepts that come up on our team that are like something we're all excited about. And even my own taste recently, I've kind of realized that more in working on Distance. Like, I got really into the Silent Hill series recently, and The Last of Us was really surprising from like the story angle. And then, just kind of seeing how some of those games are doing stuff. It's like that now I'm kind of going back and bringing a different angle into Distance. But like, I really grew up on mostly first-person shooters and games that had kind of more intricate stories. And like, we played like the Crash. Oddly enough, I basically never played Mario Kart. I actually played Crash Team Racing. I was on the other side of the table. We never had 64 or GameCube or anything. So, and my sister is the best CTR player I've ever met. So it's like kind of funny going into it that I'm realizing that there's a bit more of a subconscious influence, some of the stuff in that game. But oddly enough, Crash Bandicoot previous to CTR is almost more aligned with what the game is like. It's very, point A to point B tracks, and there's obstacles in the way, and you're trying to basically quote unquote survive and pick up as much junk as you can along the way. And it's kind of like, it's weird. Even like Motorstrom was another game that I'd say was inspirational for Kyle and I going into Distance, because they had, even if it was subtle, they had like somewhat of a world that they were trying to, they were trying to make sense of the chaos in that world. And it was like, okay, it's, it's some kind of like Burning Man type thing. And, they had all these cool visual effects and all that stuff. And that has probably been, at least from the racing angle, more inspirational than, any traditional racers that, come out at least in a while.
Huh. That's really cool.
Yeah, I mean, like, actually, weirdly enough, I played Gran Turismo a ton. And I'm always, at least when I was younger, that was probably the biggest racing game I put the most amount of time into, right behind CTR. And now I'm ending up working on the super arcadey game. But yet I still feel like there are elements of Gran Turismo, like style, and they're I don't know. There's a certain like feel of it, I guess, that I like certain nighttime tracks, and weirdly enough, that still sticks with me to this day.
Oh, that's totally understandable.
Yeah, and I did a lot of like racing dirt bikes and stuff growing up, and I guess I also was in track, so I was running, kind of racing, and so I guess racing has kind of been something that I've been excited about just in general. But again, actually like playing games, it was more of like games like MotorStorm, and some of those games that aren't usually talked about as much for being good racing games, but those were the games that I really like. Actually, even some of the motocross racing games I really enjoyed growing up.
Yeah, we get so many questions when, when we're at conventions and stuff, that people come up and they have a random futuristic racing game or arcade game that they're like, were you thinking of Pod or Extreme G or F-Zero or Wipeout? And at this point, I know what they are, but before I'd worked on Electronic Rush, I had actually basically no idea what any of those were.
Yeah.
And
you didn't have to do it. We knew.
I didn't.
Oh, okay.
I had never heard of it.
That's kind of surprising.
Yeah, but like I was saying, I never had any Nintendo consoles after NES, so it's like I was just oblivious.
So people would come up to you at these conventions and ask you about this game, and you'd just be like, "What is that?"
Yeah, I mean, I kind of like, at this point, when people ask the questions, I luckily am aware of the games, but I do feel like I walk out of those conversations learning more about those games almost every time, because I ask, I'm like, what similarity strikes you that, you're excited about, and it's always something different. It could be style, it could be audio, it could be, just a specific feature of the lapping, or, some kind of like scoring or best times thing. And I don't know. It's really interesting how those kind of stick in people's minds.
No, definitely. What has been the greatest challenge about making Distance from a conceptual standpoint? What about from a technical one?
So are you saying is that like two separate questions? Or
yeah, it's two separate questions. So like from a conceptual standpoint, when trying to come up with things for Distance or Distance in general, what have been some of the biggest hurdles that you've had, and what have been some of the biggest technical hurdles that you guys have had?
Well, I guess I'll give you my opinion on it with I guess both. From the conceptual angle, probably the two biggest challenges that I've had with the game, or the storytelling angle, has been one where, like, I can think, and compare it to like first-person shooters or any other type of game, and be like, I think I have a strong idea of what we could do with the story and how to implement it, and then every single time you run into this issue of, it's a really fast-paced racing game, and it's really hard to focus on the environment and, be able to, and especially from the art perspective, there's just a lot of art content that's required to tell a story. So it's actually probably been the most fun challenge of the whole thing, is trying to find, just interesting ways to integrate story elements and integrate mystery into the environment, because I've just basically never seen that in a racing game before, where it was actively like, they were actually trying to tell an interesting story about the backstory of the world. But otherwise, I think there's always been a small thing where it was so heavily based off of Nitronic Rush, we kind of had to compete with Nitronic Rush for like the first half of the development, where you're basically like, you've already kind of set a standard and even maybe an expectation, and if you want to like do something different, or you want to try to branch out in some way, we've had this like mental tether, I think, that it took a while to kind of figure out, okay, why is Distance different from Nitronic Rush, and why is it better than Nitronic Rush? So those, I mean, conceptually, those have been really fascinating and interesting challenges, but it definitely was not something I was expecting, I guess, going in.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the most part, I agree with everything that Jordan said there. I think, like, technically, the thing that's been hardest, at least for me personally on the team, is just creating the level editor. I mean, that was a huge process, and it still is. It's still something that we're working on quite a bit, all the time. And it's one that I think all of us were passionate about kind of going into the project, because we knew the potential was there, and it's one of the coolest parts about early access and even the beta for us, was seeing that kind of it's almost like seeing everybody creating great levels with it, for the first time was really amazing. So I feel like it's paid off at this point already, but it definitely was a big technical challenge for us.
I can definitely believe that. It's an insanely detailed tool, and it's the same tool that you guys use, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so that was part of it too, is that we wanted to make it kind of for ourselves, but then make it a little bit more user friendly so that it is possible for others to use it. But and that's something that, like I said, we're still working on. And another technical challenge, I wouldn't say it's necessarily just kind of generic, but is working with Unity, because up to this point we actually created every engine from scratch. And what I mean by that is just essentially the entire code, besides things like DirectX or maybe like Wise for audio, was completely written by ourselves. And this was the first game that we ever used a kind of a third-party engine with.
Was it kind of weird switching over to Unity from your own engines?
Yeah, well, that's what I was just going to say, is that it was a bit of a technical challenge, and still is, just because there's certain limitations that Unity has, like with the graphics engine or with their input system, you know, or some things like their networking, you know, that we just can't really access because it's their own code and we just don't have access to that. So those have been kind of tricky, and we've kind of tried to work around some of those things as much as we could, but it's definitely been a little bit different for us since we had never really done that before.
Yeah, and that one really goes in waves, because it's one of those things where you initially start working with Unity and it's just like, wow, you can do all of this stuff that we never could do in our previous engine, and our previous engine took like years to get to the point where it was even kind of close to Unity, you know, like in terms of just usability on the code end. And then it's like, okay, so you got all these cool features, but then you get kind of blocked and you're like, okay, the physics are way different in this than they were in Nitronic, and there are some bugs we just have no idea how to fix. So then you spend forever on that, you know, and you finally break through there, and then you kind of get another good roll, and it's like, okay, now we're making a lot of progress with some other new feature, but then you get blocked again. So, I mean, it's like, it's going to be like that with pretty much any external tool you ever use.
Yeah.
It's just one of those where it's so critical to the development of the game that everyone kind of has their own share of issues with it at some point. And overall, we have really enjoyed working with it, and being able to use it for multi-platform has been really incredible.
Yeah.
But you know, there's always going to be some random, you know, hurdle that you kind of have to be prepared for going down the road.
You mentioned when we were talking about the level editor, I had a question popped up spontaneously. Have you guys ever found yourselves getting inspired or getting ideas from the levels that the community has made?
Oh yeah, all the time, I would say. I mean, actually, we haven't really been working on levels as much recently because we've been working on so much other like technical features.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm excited to get back into working on levels, just because there's been a lot of things that I've seen kind of the community members do that I was like, oh man, that would be cool to integrate into an official level at some point. So, but yeah, totally, it's definitely inspirational to see what community's doing.
Yeah, and now that people are actually starting to take specific story mode elements and kind of create their own horror themed level, or you know, a level that uses the teleporters in a really dramatic way, it's like it's just crazy, because you can definitely like finish the level and just be like thinking for like 10 minutes straight of like, oh, that is like a completely different way of approaching that specific art piece or something that you just never thought of before. And instead of, you know, because you can sit and talk about it for forever, but creating something, you know, it's basically the show versus tell mentality. You know, if I play through it, then I'm like, you know, I get the whole picture. If, you know, we could sit around and talk about the theoretical uses of the horror elements for forever, but seeing it in practice, I mean, actually probably more than anything is seeing how people switch the audio and the music in certain areas, and it's like, oh, I really wish I could make this smoother for them, you know, because I want to do something similar now, you know. Yeah. So hopefully that turns into a feature they can use someday. But
awesome, so they better keep it up. That's a collective message.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A lot of racing games lately are tending to focus on incorporating RPG-like elements into their gameplay. Was this something that you guys consider with Distance or Nitronic Rush, and why'd you choose to approach the arcade style?
Well, I'd say, weirdly enough, I guess one part of the game, I guess this kind of goes a little back to the inspiration concept, but I actually, just in general, this goes back to the concept of none of us are like the traditional racing game person. We're like, we play a racing game and we like, I'd say up until this point we weren't massive on, yeah, we got to get the most ridiculous high time and grind on a level over and over and over again until we get it. Like, it's actually kind of becoming more fun as an activity to me now, but I'm encouraged to find a way to make it like really engaging for myself, because especially Kyle and I are people that just get bored with stuff so quickly. Like, I'll buy a game that's like $20 and I'll put my half an hour in and I'll be done.
Man. Oh man, I know what you mean. I'm right there with you. Holy cow.
Because I mean, just the concept of putting, you know, like 10 hours in is tough. And like, it takes a certain kind of game for me to just really get into it. I think the only game that I've ever really quote unquote grinded on is Rock Band 2. and it was mostly because I was getting better, and it was actually rewarding. But in games where it's like, basically the concept of grinding for me, I'm actually a lot more extreme than Kyle. Like Kyle does get a little bit more out of
Played
the
a lot of
elements.
RPGs
Yeah.
in my day.
But it's one of those things where when we're like thinking about trying to make it so that you're like earning XP and stuff. Like I just played the Sonic All Stars racing game. They have the ability to earn XP, and every time that counter goes up, I'm just like, come on, just skip it. I don't care about this stupid XP. Like I have no idea what that means actually. So for me personally, it's harder to get excited about implementing some of those specific features, but I do like unlocks. So I think most people like that. So that's something that'd be cool to do someday. We just haven't really figured out how to like make it feel very satisfying.
Yeah, unlocks are a really, really tricky business.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of those things for us where we're more excited about kind of like you accomplish certain sort of set things in the game, and then that unlocks it. Like maybe you beat the story, or you get a certain number of medals, or you do something like that, and that would unlock something. Versus you're randomly collecting XP throughout time. It's just kind of changing how we think about it. But I mean, I wouldn't be opposed to doing something with RPG elements maybe at some point, but I think for distance, it's almost like we just would rather keep it simple. That's sort of a whole nother layer of complexity. So
absolutely.
Can you guys tell me a bit about the dynamic / working environment at Refract? Like, what's a typical day in the life for you guys?
Oh man. Well, I'd say probably the easiest way to answer it is there really isn't one. Like every day is so different. Yeah, I mean, not really intentionally, but it's just one of those things where because we try our best to keep it a passion-driven environment. If you're not feeling it change is kind of the mentality. So our work schedule sometimes, I guess we all try to sync up the best we can, but I've definitely noticed a trend where we can get onto like an earlier work schedule. Early for us is like actually pretty late for a lot of people, but we can get started in the late morning or something like that, and then we've kind of had this thing where we work a lot of hours, and a lot of times it'll just be one of those things where you'll work from like noon to 3 a.m. or actually it would be noon to 3 or 4 a.m. a lot of times, and then you keep as crunch happens or whatever, you're trying to build up to some milestone, you just start to stay up later and later, and every person on the team is definitely different with that, but for the most part we tend to kind of start later and work pretty late, and people come in and work pretty much whenever they want. And especially right now there's just 3 of us that are working together in the workspace, and everyone else is remote. And for that, that it's even more sporadic. It's like basically when people can fit it in. People work on the stuff that they want to work on. But we try to, kind of keep it so that it's like we have a rough idea of what our next update is and what task we're trying to do. And it's also like it can be tough to do this, but we do try to encourage it where it's like if you're finding something fun and interesting to work on, to just really bias towards that, because it's just so much easier to put the hours in and even be productive when you're working on something that you're like you wake up in the morning and you want to get started on it. So like right before we launched early access, like at least for me, I was really heavily focused on the marketing end of it. I was supposed to be creating a lot of marketing content, and I randomly got it in my head that maybe like if people are doing YouTube videos and stuff, like they would be more interested if some of the story content was improved. And the one that I really wanted to work on was the horror level, and I just had a lot of these things bouncing around in my head. And it turned into like I was only going to work on it like a day, and it ended up being like a week and a half or something. Probably twice as many hours as I would have planned on, just because I was so excited to work on it. The more I worked on it, then the artists were getting excited about it, and they were creating art, and then I got excited because they had new content, so I busted out a ton of new audio, and it just ended up being, like something none of us were really planning on, was that level to be completely revamped before early access, but it's just kind of how it happened, and I'm glad I did. I don't know if it was like a net win on the marketing angle, but it was like I think the game was better as a result. So yeah, it's very sporadic over here, but we're trying to keep it exciting, I guess, from the developer perspective.
Yeah, probably the best thing, or at least one of the best things about it, is that we are pretty flexible when it comes to time schedules. And, you know, like Jordan was saying, we can, you know, some of us can get here early if we want, or some of us can get here late. You know, it doesn't really matter as long as we can sync up at some point in the day. That's kind of the important part. But, you know, for example, let's say you get a bad night of sleep. It's not like 8 a.m. you got to be at work. You know, it's pretty flexible that way, which is really nice.
I'll bet.
It's curious at moments for sure.
Yeah.
What were you guys planning on doing before you got into game development?
Oh man.
Yeah.
I think I wanted to do games ever since I was like 10 years old.
Yeah, it was almost the exact same for me. Like, I really never had anyone tell me that I shouldn't do it. So I kind of didn't really have a good backup plan. Like, I worked as a web developer during high school, but I still always kind of planned to go to DigiPen, and I only ever applied to DigiPen, so I kind of got lucky there too. So, I mean, I was always interested in music, but I knew that if I wanted to do the whole music career thing, it would just, you know, the path to that was radically different than doing the game developer thing. So I didn't like have an amazing plan for it, but it was like always in the back of my mind. So I guess I'm glad that my dream really was that I would be able to do game development, mostly programming is actually what I wanted to do, and then be able to somehow do music on the side. So it's kind of like magical that I ended up somehow getting to do that.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, on top of you do a lot of other things as well now.
Yeah.
But
Get my hands on everything.
My dad really wanted me to be an engineer ever since he's a mechanical engineer, and he really wanted me to be an engineer. And I didn't really want to be an engineer actually. I mean, not that programming isn't engineering. It definitely is, but it's different. I think about it a little bit differently. And so when I originally applied to DigiPen, I actually applied for their computer engineering degree just to kind of appease my dad. And then I moved into the programming degree while I was there because I realized I didn't want to do engineering. So
yeah.
What was it like moving from DigiPen into your own studio?
I'd say, actually, weirdly enough, it was extremely similar except for one thing, which was that it was just us.
Yeah.
And it was basically quiet. And when you're a DigiPen, it's like at the moment it kind of seems annoying. It's just there's tons of people everywhere and everybody's crazy and it's hard to find a quiet space to work and focus with the team. But then when you're out of there, it's just you instantly realize that you had friends that were working on projects that were nothing like your project, and you got to see that, and you got to, you know, maybe even partially be a part of it. You know, they can potentially ask you to try it, or you talk about some random technical thing, or actually more than anything, you know, everybody's working on assignments, and everyone, you know, at some point needs to ask someone else for help. And we realize all of a sudden that our resources in terms of asking someone for help are extremely limited. We didn't have 2,000 people just randomly in the building with us. So that was actually kind of a hard adjustment, I'd say, at first, realizing that it's like a lot of our friends had moved. Either they were busy with, you know, jobs in the Seattle area, or they moved to California and stuff. So it's like the people that we knew, you know, was limited as well, at least, you know, locally. But as we, you know, finally move along, I'd say it's gotten a little bit easier because we've gotten, you know, a bit more integrated with other developers, and we also slightly know what we're doing, I guess.
Yeah.
More.
Yeah.
That was at least for me. I don't know for you if there was something else.
I mean, it was very similar in that I mean, in reality, the end of DigiPen, we kind of, like, we had classes, but the actual last semester of DigiPen's actually quite easy in comparison to every other semester there. And so we were already kind of in the Refract mode almost, where we were like planning the company and everything else. So it wasn't really a big transition, I would say, in that way. But yeah, besides just not seeing a bunch of people every day, that was the one transition that was kind of different.
I mean, there also is the concept of some structure that was kind of lost, like that we didn't really think we would have to like make up, which is that, you know, you can have some class at like 9 in the morning you have to be there for, and then it's like then you work in between the classes, and all of a sudden we had this huge time, you know, it's like you all the time in the world to work on literally whatever you want. And at first it seems like, oh yeah, total freedom, do whatever, and then you start to realize I probably should have some structure for what I'm doing.
Yep.
Because it's just easy to just poke around at something for, you know, 2 days straight and realize, oh, that should have only took me 2 hours. Like, I'm not really sure where the time went, kind of thing.
Yeah.
How do you feel Distance was able to get so much attention, considering how crowded the indie space is?
I mean, it definitely helps that I guess we've been technically doing this kind of game for a very long time. Like the first, I think actually, yeah, to this day, there was a post on IndieGames.com that was the first ever mention of Nitronic Rush, and it was probably in like May of 2011. And pretty much ever since then, it's been the slow trickle of just, you know, slightly more and more people hear about Nitronic Rush. And then, you know, when we did Distance, there was kind of the Kickstarter helped a lot in terms of like shifting over to a new project. But how many years has that been now? You know, it's like 4 or 5 years or something now. So
Yeah.
it's not something where, at least for us, I haven't ever really felt like, oh yeah, thanks to that one massive wave, that's what secured, quote unquote, secured us, you know, people knowing who we are at all. I'd say probably like Kickstarter was a big one, and random, you know, things happen with Nitronic where the big video comes out or something like that. But for the most part, I think it's just us trying to keep track of people who are talking about and interested in it, and trying to learn more about why they're interested in it, either, you know, a past project or a Distance, and just, you know, do our best to encourage people to be talking in the community. And you know, and now it's a lot easier now that the game is out. People can be directly involved in playing and giving feedback and creating levels, and it's kind of just gotten easier, I guess, over time. But, you know, versus talking about the theoretical game when, you know, we were first doing it.
Yep.
But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's at least my random opinion on it.
No, that was a pretty good answer. Yeah. Why do you guys think many of the bigger studios and developers are going towards the indie route?
So I guess, what do you mean by indie route exactly? Is it kind of
like Ubisoft did Child of Light and what was it, Valiant Hearts, and some larger, more bigger name studios are starting to create sort of games that fit the quote unquote indie genre. Why do you that's what I mean.
Okay. I guess my initial thought on that is I have seen a bit of a trend there a little bit. I mean, so like, what was it, 2008 or something was supposed to be like the start of the indies with like Braid and maybe a couple other ones. And I think the big shocker there was more just that people didn't really ever think about the idea of such a small team making a game. And the production values being reasonable enough that it wasn't like a shocker. But then it was like, it kind of became a bit of a style, at least from my perspective. And, you know, that's kind of where it's a bit more muddied now, is like there are really big budget games that are going for the indie style. And, you know, indie style is kind of extremely, you know, who knows what on earth you want to label that as. But we've definitely, from our perspective, we've been to events where other indies will basically be like, these guys aren't indie. Like, you know, it's just a really weird thing where they're like, you know, this should be an indie event and these guys are, you know, not indie because they're using Unreal or, you know, whatever they think we're using. And it's, at least to me, that was a bit educational. I don't really hold it against them or anything, because they're thinking that we're not even that our game looked like it was a big production game, but it's the fact that when every other game looks like a you know, small 2D game, a 3D game being made by a small group of people just seems really, we actually do kind of weirdly look out of place sometimes. But what's cool is basically in the past few years, it's just grown a lot. There are a lot of real, you know, like cool looking 3D games that are being made, and all that really comes down to is the tools keep getting better, people keep getting more clever, and things like Kickstarter are enabling those projects. So long story short, seeing like Ubisoft or any other bigger studio, there's probably a lot of reasons that it would be attractive. Yeah, if you can get away with a small budget and make a decent chunk of money, that's always attractive to pretty much anybody who's looking to make money.
Yeah.
And if the management side of it is minimal, you know, it's like you get one guy on your publishing end to just watch over that project and give him a little bit of money and then see a decent return, like that probably looks promising to a lot of people. But I'd say that, weirdly enough, like, even when we think about the concept of looking at like Rush or some other game from the 90s as an inspiration, it's kind of a subconscious thing. But if you actually look at the teams for a lot of those games, even like the original Crash Bandicoot, I was just talking to Kyle about that today, it was like 7 people that made that game. Like, we have 7 people working on this game. Like, basically we are at this point what a AAA team was in the 90s. It's kind of just come full circle where it's just a lot cheaper now. And you know, we can basically create stuff in a more clever way a lot of times. So money helps a lot, and I'd say style, there's just a different set of expectations. Like, we've really been blessed, I'd say, in that the Distance is coming out at a time where I was really concerned about this when we first started working on Distance, because we saw this a lot with Nitronic, which is that racing games, there was no such thing as an indie racing game. Luckily, there were 90s racing games, so that were similar team size and all that stuff, so we had some expectation in terms of, or we had something to reference when we were thinking of, team size and how much money it was going to cost and how big of a game it would end up being. But with the Crew and with Drive Club and Gran Turismo, the feature list and the car list and the asset list is just unbelievable. So I was afraid that people would look at Distance, and no matter how small the team and how small the price would be, it would still be compared to the big games. And now things have changed enough where, like, bigger studios are making smaller games and changing that expectation. And now things like Carmageddon and Road Redemption is another really great one, where they fit in that space pretty well. Like, you can kind of walk into that when you pay $15 or $20 and you have a certain expectation that's not ridiculous. And then, I think that helps the publishers too when they're looking at those kinds of things.
Yep.
That makes perfect sense to me.
I don't know. It seems like a cool idea that, you would be able to, if we were a big studio someday, still be able to do small projects.
Yeah.
And it's just especially crazy that you can do a small project now that actually is not really that small.
Yeah.
It's a big, pretty crazy project. What's weird to me is or it's not weird, but it's just something fun to look at, is the AA studio, or triple B, whatever you want to call it, where it's not $100 million game, it's not $100,000 game, it's something in between. There are a lot of them in Seattle, and they're 20 to 40 people at the studio maybe, and they're the ones actually I think who are they have to really put a flag down and figure out, because they either choose to go the indie route or they choose to go the AAA route, and at least currently that's a popular trend I've seen, is people don't really know what to do with the $40 game. It's what should they expect there?
I think one of the most recent games that actually, I would say, felt like that area of development would be the new Alien game, Isolation.
Oh yeah.
That was definitely in that area.
Yeah, that game was definitely you can actually play it for a while, kind of thinking that it's just a very expensive indie game. And then it just starts to open up and you realize that, yes, a lot of money was put into this game.
Mm-hmm.
But I did really appreciate that they didn't make it feel like over the top. It has to have 1 billion features. It was fairly minimal, but yet it was worth the full price. That's a cool one.
Definitely. What advice do you guys have for those out there in the ether that are looking to get into game development?
I'd say the same thing that was told to us a million times, and I guess I'll just keep repeating it because it is still really good advice, is just make stuff. Especially now, and especially following that previous question, it's easier than ever to make stuff, and basically, there are a lot of people that kind of go into the game industry thinking that, especially the whole game designer concept, you can kind of walk into it saying, oh, game designers sit down and they design it all out, and then someone goes and makes it. But the reality is, the only time that ever happens is if it's like a $150 million game and there's someone at the top who is still insanely busy because they have to manage, the entirety of some ridiculous game. But on the small end, you can do a lot. You don't even really know. You have to be like an expert in programming to get started and make something really cool. And the more you do it, the more you'll learn.
Yeah.
So, I've gotten really far so far with not having insanely good math skills or insanely good art skills, in that I was able to do what I could and then find the right people. For me, I found them through DigiPen. So, going to game development school is definitely a possibility. But I know tons and tons of people that just started working on their thing online. They posted it online. They start to get it out there. So it syncs up with someone, and they look at it and they're like, everything is cool about this except for the art. I can help you with the art. And even that's how Minecraft was started. It was, TIG source or whatever, and Notch is posting, and other people started to kind of, see it, and it's like, I don't know. It's especially with Unity, get the free version. Unity free is has probably about 3 times as many features as when we started working with Unity.
Yeah.
They got shadows and they got shader stuff now.
Yeah, all
and
kinds of stuff.
You're definitely like, if you think that there's some barrier, there really isn't. It's just time and effort, and depends on how crazy you want to go.
Yeah. Yeah, and there really is, like you mentioned, there really is good schools at this point too. Like, if you don't know anything about programming, there's schools, not just game development schools, but schools in general are teaching this stuff now, and so there's always that route. And obviously we came from Digipen, and I think Digipen's a great school, probably the best. So at least if you want to go into programming.
Yep. Yeah, and then I guess I'll throw one random other resource, which is a Pixel Prospector. I think it's Pixel.
Yeah,
Pixel
I've checked them out.
It's funny that website is actually starting to get so crazy with information. He's the guy who's putting it together has actually been doing a good job of like improving the findability of information. But that website is a great testament to the fact that people have written thousands of articles and put together really cool tutorials for pretty much every genre. And as games like Distance and Drift Stage and Road Redemption, all these like indie kind of racing games get developed, that'll be another one of the genres that I'm sure we'll write some more blog posts and try to share what information we've learned. But first-person exploration games and 2D platformers, there's tons of resources out there.
Yeah.
So
totally.
Getting started, it's really just finding those resources and starting to just see what clicks for you.
Just nose of the grindstone type of stuff, basically.
Yeah, and I mean, it's also one of those things where I think a lot of people think it's going to be really, really hard, and maybe for some it is. It's something where your mind just doesn't necessarily sync with it that well, but there's a lot of angles to it. So even if the art side of it or the coding side of it doesn't really work with you, there's so many parts to it. I mean, just being able to do dynamic music, if you're a musician, there's that whole side of it too. So
yeah, and I mean, definitely, like, you can download Unity free, and you can look at like a Unity tutorial, and that will help you get started pretty well. Honestly, I don't even think you have to know much about anything, and you could probably get pretty far with that. So
yeah, although the fact that Unreal is now going kind of an indie route, and people are definitely.
There's some pretty weird indie games coming out on Unreal. Let me tell you what.
You'll have to share a link with us. I actually am not really aware.
There's one specific one that I have in mind, and I'll drop you a link after this. How does it feel to finally be in early access on Steam?
I'd say really good so far. The only reason it probably wouldn't be good is if we were having issues with it. It seems like fortunately our decision to basically take our time and try to do the best we can to have a solid product before early access paid off. And now it's so much easier to just talk about the game, because always there was kind of this locked gate. It was like Kickstarter backers had it, other people didn't. There's confusion over, like pre-orders or just in general, like people working on the level editor that couldn't just like see other people's creations as easily and all that stuff. But our early access experience has been really, really good so far. And we, if nothing else from the learning aspect, is probably the most important thing to us. Whether or not it's selling well or anything else is completely disregarded compared to the fact that we're learning a lot from people, and it's decent amount of information about bugs, but more than anything, it's just about what happens when you have a new player who's never they saw the game for the first time that day, they bought it, they played through adventure mode. What were their issues? What were the weaknesses and strengths from their perspective? Especially Kickstarter is insanely valuable for gaining feedback, but at the same time, a lot of our Kickstarter backers have been intensely following. The people who give the most amount of feedback, they've also been following the game for 2 years. So it's not their feedback is valuable, but it's not the same type of feedback as someone who's a first-time player.
Yeah.
So it's really cool. I mean, like we knew of early access right when we were starting into Distance. They were kind of talking about it theoretically being a thing. So the timing is pretty much everything has worked out for us. And that early access is people kind of know what they're getting into, and hopefully that people are enjoying the game. But it's been good for us so far from my perspective.
What lies in the future for Distance and Refract?
I'd say for Distance, it's kind of going back to our passion-based working style. we try to avoid having very detailed plans for the future.
Understand.
Not so much because we don't want to like over-promising is always a little bit of a concern, and over-scoping is we're insanely good at over-scoping. So,
We are.
but more than anything, we don't really even want to lock ourselves down to something because, you know, even the level editor, just in general, like it feels like there's been like this plan to it. If you kind of like look at it now, it's like, oh, they developed that, and then you know, people create levels and they're making tweaks. But the fact that we haven't had a reason to massively change the level editor after early access is because every time that we did a version of it, you know, for the past like year or something since it's been out, it's basically been the back and forth with the community to try to figure out what are the most important things to fix and change and add. And none of that was planned at the beginning. So long story short, a lot could definitely change in the next year, and not a lot could, you know, we're always trying to keep our eye out for the new and crazy thing that we can do with the game. But the short version is, I'd say the story mode is a big passion for us to have that feel like a complete story experience, which I still think a lot of people are not really, I guess, quote unquote, prepared for what we're even like thinking of doing with the story mode. We are going to kind of explore that pretty heavily, but otherwise there's just a million multiplayer and level editor features that we're looking into potentially doing, and we'll just work on the ones that we're excited about.
Well, and then there's also the PS4 version of the game.
Yep.
You know, working on making sure that we deliver, you know, the best experience possible on the PlayStation 4.
Yeah, and then for Refract, it's, you know, we'll probably be starting to consider candidates for a future project, but honestly, I think for the most part we're going to be really heavily focused on this project right to the end, and you know, near to the end at least of the gold release, the major release on all the different platforms. So we just want to keep focused, basically.
That's good to hear, honestly. All right, well, it's been great having you guys here. Before I let you escape, though, I have one question for you, and this one's for all the bits. All right?
All right.
This is the most important question yet.
Oh man.
If you were in an 80s hair metal band, what instruments would you all play, and what would your one-hit wonder single be called?
Oh man. So let's see. Is this just us two, or is this like everyone at Refract?
Everyone at Refract.
Oh man.
For instruments, we'll stick with just you two, though.
Okay. I think Kyle's on a mic. I don't know.
Probably Mike.
Going any other way. I'm heavily split between guitar and drums. That's a tough one. I mean, especially there's so many good opportunities in a hair metal band.
There's like every instrument in there. You can make up an instrument and put it in a hair metal band. Nobody will question you about it.
I mean, guitar. I don't know. I'm not in real life, but I might have to go with maybe the theremin. Maybe go for something slightly more extreme.
I'm gonna have to look that up and like put a picture in the video because I've never heard of that before.
All right, I think I'm saying it right. But yeah, let's go with that.
What would your one-hit wonder single be called?
Oh my gosh. Kyle is the expert with 80s names. I don't know.
Oh man. The only thing I'm thinking of is Crazy Train with Ozzy, so I keep thinking like Crazy Bus or something.
some sort of like knockoff of Crazy Train.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just Wheels on the Bus set to Crazy Train.
Yeah.
Close enough. Well, that's like all the other
jumping
80s
off the cliff
metal.
in the Crazy Bus.
Yeah. Every album cover, every music video is just a bus jumping stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
It's perfect.
I'm down.
I hope that this happens someday. I hope that 80s hair metal comes back and we get to see Refract of the hair metal band.
I agree. It would be good.
Project. Sounds perfect.
All right. Well, seriously, thank you guys for taking the time out of your busy schedules to let me ask you some questions for the internet's enjoyment.
Oh, thanks for having us.
It's been cool. All right. I have no idea how to end this, so I'm just going to say bye now. You guys you guys can say bye too if you want, I guess.
All right. Bye everybody.
Yep, take care.